The gate opened slowly, the way it always did when Thomas Whitmore pulled the old iron handle with both hands, because at 71 years old, his body no longer moved as fast as his mind. He wore a gray uniform that did not belong to him, a cap pulled low over silver hair, and a face that thousands of employees across the country would have recognized instantly if they had bothered to look twice. But the woman stepping out of the black car that morning did not look twice. She barely looked once. To her, he was simply the man standing between her and the front door of a mansion she had already, in her mind, decided belonged to her. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Her name was Claire Bennett, and in exactly 180 days, she would become the wife of Daniel Whitmore, heir to one of the largest fortunes built quietly outside the public eye in the last 3 decades. She did not know that the empire she was marrying into had a founder who was standing 4 feet away from her, holding a clipboard that meant nothing, wearing a name tag that said nothing true. She did not know that the man she was about to speak to was the very reason any of this, the gates, the gardens, the marble floors waiting behind them, existed at all. She only saw an old employee, replaceable, forgettable, beneath her attention. What she said to him in the next 10 seconds would echo through this family for the rest of their lives. It was not shouted. It was not cruel in the way people expect cruelty to sound. It was worse than that, because it was careless, the kind of comment made by someone who has never once considered that the person in front of them might matter. Thomas Whitmore had built and lost and rebuilt 3 companies before this woman was born. He had negotiated with men who controlled entire industries. And in this one ordinary moment, at his own son's front gate, he simply stood there and absorbed it, silent, because the test he had designed for her had only just begun, and everything depended on her never knowing who he really was. Here is what almost no one in this story knew that morning. Thomas Whitmore had not left for his annual retreat, the one his staff quietly announced to explain his absence for the past several weeks. There was no retreat, there was no overseas trip, no private island, no extended stay at a wellness clinic that his assistants described so convincingly to anyone who asked. Instead, the founder of one of the country's most private fortunes had arranged, in complete secrecy, to become a temporary gate attendant on his own son's estate, wearing a uniform borrowed from a real employee who had agreed, for reasons of loyalty that ran deeper than any paycheck, to disappear for a while and let his employer take his place. Why would a man worth more than most Fortune 500 companies choose to spend his final years standing at a gate in the cold, greeting strangers who had no idea who he was? The answer began nearly 3 decades earlier, with a different woman, a different fortune, and a betrayal so complete that Thomas Whitmore had never spoken about it publicly, not once, not even to his own son. He had watched wealth destroy people before it ever had the chance to reveal who they truly were underneath it. He had promised himself, quietly, in a hospital room the night his wife died, that his son would never walk into a marriage blind the way he almost had. Claire Bennett smiled at the cameras. She smiled at the wedding planners, the photographers, the reporters who had already begun writing profiles calling her the perfect match for the Whitmore family legacy. Everyone around Daniel believed his fiancée was exactly who she appeared to be, warm, devoted, endlessly patient with his demanding schedule. Everyone except the one man standing quietly at the gate each morning, watching the version of her that only existed when she believed no one important was paying attention. And on this particular morning, as she brushed past him without a second glance toward the front door of the house she would one day inherit, Thomas Whitmore made a decision that would change everything. He would not confront her. He would not warn his son. He would not raise a single alarm bell that could be dismissed as an old man's paranoia or an overprotective father's jealousy. Instead, he would remain exactly where he was, invisible in plain sight, absorbing every dismissive word, every careless comment, every small, unguarded moment that revealed who Claire Bennett truly was beneath the performance. Because somewhere in the next few months, before the wedding invitations were finalized, before the vows were written, he intended to find out one thing with absolute certainty. Did she love his son, or did she love what his son's name could buy her? The camera holds on his face as the gate closes behind her, the metal clicking into place with a sound far louder than it should have been. He does not move. He does not speak. He simply watches her walk toward the house that bears his family's name, a house she believes will one day be hers, built by a man she just dismissed as beneath her notice. What she said to him in that first exchange will not be forgotten. What she does not yet know is that every word, every glance, every small cruelty from this point forward is being watched by the one person in the world with the power to take it all away. To understand why a man of Thomas Whitmore's stature would trade his boardroom for a gatehouse, you first have to understand what he stood to lose. His son Daniel was not simply an heir on paper. He was the last living piece of a marriage that ended far too early, the only person left who carried his late wife's laugh, her stubbornness, her habit of trusting people long before they had earned it. Thomas had spent 3 decades building something no one could take from his son by force. What he feared now was something no lawyer, no security team, and no fortress of a mansion could ever protect against. A person willing to take it from the inside, one wedding vow at a time. 3 questions sat at the center of everything that was about to unfold on this estate, questions that even Thomas himself did not yet have complete answers to. Was Claire Bennett truly the woman she presented to the cameras, the charities, and his son? Or was there another version of her that only revealed itself when she believed the room held no one of consequence? What exactly was she hoping to gain from this marriage? A partner she loved, or a name, a fortune, and a life she had never had to work for? And if the answers to those questions were the ones Thomas feared most, what was he actually prepared to do about it, now that his own son's heart hung in the balance? Daniel Whitmore, for his part, had no idea any of this was happening. He believed his father was resting, recovering from the stress of another failed business negotiation overseas, exactly as the family spokesperson had explained to the press weeks earlier. He spent his mornings reviewing wedding logistics with Claire, his afternoons managing the company his father had built, and his evenings convincing himself that he had finally found the one person in his life who wanted nothing from him except his presence. He was, by every outward measure, a man deeply and completely in love. What he could not see, standing at the center of his own story, was the quiet observer positioned at his front gate, watching every version of his fiancée that he himself had never been allowed to witness. And then there was Claire herself, 29 years old, raised in modest circumstances 2 states away, a woman who had spent years telling anyone who asked that money had never mattered to her, that she simply wanted to be loved for who she was. Her friends described her as generous. Her co-workers, before she left her job to plan the wedding full-time, described her as ambitious in a way that occasionally unsettled them, though none of them could quite explain why. Somewhere between those 2 descriptions sat the truth, and only one person on this entire estate had positioned himself close enough, quiet enough, and patient enough to find it before the wedding invitations were ever sealed. What Thomas Whitmore did not yet know, standing at that gate morning after morning, was that his test would not stay contained to Claire alone. Secrets rarely do. Before this story reaches its end, a housekeeper who has served this family for 11 years will notice something is wrong with the new gate attendant. A close friend of Daniel's will begin asking questions no one wants answered. And Claire Bennett, the woman everyone believes they already understand completely, will be forced into a single moment where her true character can no longer hide behind a smile for the cameras. The gate had only just opened. What waited behind it would test every person in this family in ways none of them could yet imagine. Thomas Whitmore did not inherit a single dollar of the fortune that now carried his family's name. He grew up in a small manufacturing town where his own father worked double shifts at a steel plant that closed twice during his childhood, and where the idea of financial security felt more like a rumor than a reality. By 19, he had already worked 3 jobs at once, saving every spare dollar toward a single idea he refused to let go of: a small logistics company that could move goods faster and cheaper than anyone else in the region. Nobody believed in that idea except him. 12 years later, that small company had become the foundation of an empire that would eventually stretch across 4 industries and employ tens of thousands of people who had never met the man behind it. Success did not soften Thomas. If anything, it sharpened something in him that had always been there: a deep and permanent suspicion of people who arrived only after the money did. He had learned, through years of hard experience, that wealth acts like a magnet, drawing in people whose intentions have nothing to do with who you actually are. Business partners who vanished the moment a deal turned difficult. Friends from his old neighborhood who resurfaced only when they needed something. He built walls around himself that most people mistook for coldness, when in reality, they were the only protection he had ever found against being used by people who claimed to care about him. The one relationship that ever fully dismantled those walls was his marriage. Margaret Whitmore had known him before any of it, before the first successful contract, before the first million, back when he was simply a determined young man with dirt under his fingernails and a plan nobody else believed in. She never once asked him for anything he had not already offered freely, and for 26 years, she was the only person on earth who saw him completely, without performance, without suspicion standing between them. When she died of a sudden illness far too young, Thomas Whitmore did not simply lose a wife. He lost the only proof he had ever needed that love could exist without an agenda attached to it. Daniel was 16 when his mother passed away, and in the years that followed, Thomas made a private vow that would quietly shape every decision he made from that point forward. His son would inherit everything: the company, the properties, the name that opened doors across the country. But Thomas refused to let his son walk into that inheritance unprepared for what it would attract. He had watched colleagues, friends, and even distant relatives get quietly destroyed by people who married into money and slowly hollowed out everything the marriage was supposed to represent. He was not going to watch it happen to the one person who still carried Margaret's laugh in the way he tilted his head when something amused him. For years, that vow remained theoretical, something Thomas assumed he would never actually need to act on. Daniel dated occasionally throughout his 20s, nothing serious enough to trigger his father's deeper concern. But the moment Daniel introduced Claire Bennett at a family dinner 18 months ago, something in Thomas Whitmore shifted. It was not one single red flag. It was smaller than that, a pattern of tiny observations that most people would never notice: the way her attention moved subtly toward certain rooms of the house during the tour, the way her questions about the company always circled back to numbers rather than the work itself. Nothing conclusive, nothing he could say out loud to his son without sounding paranoid or jealous of the woman making Daniel happy. So Thomas Whitmore did what he had always done when faced with a problem too important to leave to assumption. He built a plan. Quietly, methodically, without informing a single member of his family, he arranged to disappear from public view for what everyone believed would be a period of rest and travel. In reality, he spent that time transforming himself into someone Claire Bennett would never suspect: an aging gate attendant with nothing to offer her, nothing to threaten her position, and nothing standing between her and the life she wanted except the small, forgettable indignity of having to walk past him every single morning. What she chose to reveal to that forgettable old man would determine everything. Daniel Whitmore grew up watching his father build something extraordinary, but he grew up wanting something entirely different for himself. Where Thomas measured success in contracts and expansion, Daniel measured it in the quiet, ordinary moments his father rarely had time for: family dinners that lasted past 9 o'clock, weekend trips with no business calls interrupting them, a version of life that felt whole rather than simply successful. He worked hard within the company his father built, eventually taking over as president of the logistics division. But colleagues often described him as the more approachable Whitmore, the one who remembered assistants' birthdays and asked about their families before asking about quarterly numbers. He had his father's discipline, but none of his father's guarded distance. That openness, the very quality that made Daniel beloved among his employees, was also the quality that left him most vulnerable when Claire Bennett walked into his life at a charity gala 18 months ago. She approached him not knowing who he was, or so it appeared, striking up a conversation about the auction items rather than the family name printed on his place card. For a man who had spent years wondering whether every woman who showed interest in him actually saw him or simply saw his last name, that first conversation felt like proof he had been waiting for his entire adult life. She laughed at his jokes before she knew what his company was worth. At least, that was the story Daniel told himself, over and over, in the months that followed. Claire Bennett's own history was less publicly documented than Daniel's, which was, depending on how one chooses to interpret it, either coincidence or careful design. She had grown up in a working-class town 2 states away, the daughter of a single mother who worked as a receptionist for over 20 years at a small accounting firm. Friends from her hometown remembered her as ambitious even as a teenager, someone who spoke often about wanting a life entirely different from the one she had been raised in. She left for the city at 18, worked a series of jobs in marketing and event planning, and by the time she met Daniel, she had built a modest but respectable career for herself, one she gave up almost immediately once the engagement was announced. Publicly, Claire became exactly the fiancée the tabloids and family friends expected, gracious at events, endlessly supportive of Daniel's schedule, quick with a smile whenever a camera appeared. She spoke often in interviews about wanting a quiet life despite marrying into extraordinary wealth, about caring more for Daniel's character than his circumstances. Family friends who met her described her as warm, if occasionally distant in unguarded moments, the kind of distance easily explained away as nerves about joining such a prominent family. Daniel noticed none of it as concerning. He saw only a woman who had chosen him specifically, deliberately, in a world full of people who might have chosen his name instead. What Daniel did not know, and what Thomas had only begun to suspect in the months leading up to his disappearance from public life, was the widening gap between the Claire the world saw and the Claire who existed when she believed no one important was watching. A close friend of Daniel's, someone who had known the family for over a decade, had quietly voiced private concerns to no one but herself. Small comments Claire made about the estate, about staff, about what marriage into this family would ultimately provide her. Nothing was ever said directly to Daniel. Nothing was ever confirmed. But somewhere between the version of Claire the public adored and the version only glimpsed in passing, unguarded moments, a very different story was waiting to be uncovered, one Thomas Whitmore had positioned himself, quietly and completely, to finally see. The plan Thomas Whitmore put into motion required a level of secrecy he had not exercised since the early days of building his company, when a single leaked contract could have ended everything before it began. He could not simply tell his household staff what he intended to do, because even the most loyal employee might let something slip in an unguarded conversation, a comment overheard by the wrong person at the wrong time. Instead, he approached one man directly, Walter Griggs, the estate's actual gate attendant, a man who had worked the property for nearly 9 years and who had earned, through nearly a decade of quiet reliability, a level of trust Thomas rarely extended to anyone outside his immediate family. Walter did not ask many questions when Thomas explained what he needed. He had seen enough in his years on this estate, enough careless comments from guests who assumed staff were invisible, enough conversations never meant to be overheard, to understand exactly why his employer might want to see the household through eyes nobody expected to be watching. Walter agreed to take an extended leave, generously compensated and carefully explained to the rest of the household as a family emergency requiring his attention out of state. In his place, an aging, unremarkable gate attendant would appear, one whose face nobody on this estate, apart from a small handful of Thomas's most trusted advisors, would ever think to question. Transforming himself was, in some strange way, the easiest part of the entire plan. Thomas Whitmore had spent 30 years being recognized in boardrooms and photographed at industry events, but he had also spent those same 30 years cultivating a reputation for personal privacy so complete that very few people outside his closest circle actually knew what he looked like in casual, ordinary clothing. He let his beard grow out for several weeks before beginning, wore glasses he did not need, and adopted the slower, more deliberate movements of a man who had spent his life in physical labor rather than corporate leadership. The uniform itself, gray and unremarkable, did the rest of the work simply by existing. People rarely look closely at a uniform. They see the role it represents and move on. The company's spokesperson announced to the small circle of press that regularly covered the Whitmore family that Thomas would be taking an extended sabbatical, citing health and rest as the reason, a story vague enough to discourage further questions, but specific enough to sound entirely plausible. Daniel accepted the explanation without suspicion, distracted as he was by wedding preparations and the daily demands of running his division of the company. If he found it slightly unusual that his father chose this particular moment, mere months before the wedding, to disappear from public life entirely, he did not dwell on it. Grief and stress had made his father unpredictable in smaller ways before. This, he assumed, was simply another version of that. On his first morning at the gate, Thomas Whitmore stood in a uniform that did not belong to him, holding a clipboard with a delivery schedule he had memorized the night before, and felt something he had not experienced in decades, complete and total invisibility. Executives who had once stood before him in tense negotiations would have walked past him without a flicker of recognition. Employees who had worked under his company for years passed through the gate each morning without a second glance in his direction. And when the first car carrying Claire Bennett approached that gate less than an hour later, Thomas understood, with absolute clarity, that the woman inside had no idea the man opening it for her held the power to end her engagement with a single sentence, and no intention of using it until he knew, beyond any doubt, whether he needed to build. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that revealed far more than Thomas Whitmore had anticipated when he first put on the gray uniform. He learned that people rarely perform for someone they consider beneath their notice, and that lesson began paying off almost immediately. On his third morning at the gate, Claire arrived nearly 20 minutes late for a meeting with the wedding planner, and rather than acknowledging the delay, she directed her frustration at Thomas, blaming him for not having her car pulled around quickly enough, though the request had never actually been made. It was a small moment, forgettable to anyone not paying close attention. Thomas noted it anyway, the way she assumed his time mattered less than her own. Not every moment painted the same picture, and Thomas forced himself to remain honest about that, refusing to let his existing suspicion color every observation. One afternoon, Claire stopped at the gate longer than necessary, asking Thomas, whom she knew only as the temporary attendant, whether he had children, whether his family lived nearby, whether the work was manageable for someone his age. The questions felt genuine, delivered with an ease that caught him slightly off guard. For nearly 10 minutes, standing at the very gate where she had dismissed him days earlier, Claire spoke to him as though he were simply a person rather than a function of the household, and Thomas found himself, despite every instinct telling him to remain skeptical, unsure of what he had just witnessed. That uncertainty became the defining tension of these early weeks. Thomas began keeping a private log each night, documenting these small moments without editorializing, determined to let a genuine pattern emerge rather than confirming a conclusion he had already reached before the test began. He noted the day Claire spoke sharply to a housekeeper over a minor scheduling mix-up, using a tone Thomas had never once heard her use in front of Daniel or any member of the press. He noted, just as carefully, the afternoon she personally carried a fallen, elderly guest's belongings up the front steps rather than calling for staff to handle it, an act with no audience, no camera, and no possible benefit to her beyond simple decency. It was during this stretch that Thomas first noticed Margaret Alvarez, the household's longtime housekeeper, watching him with a lingering, uncertain attention he had not expected. Margaret had worked for this family for 11 years, long enough to know the rhythms of the estate intimately, long enough to notice small inconsistencies most people would miss entirely. She said nothing directly, but Thomas caught her studying his hands one afternoon, hands that moved with a precision and confidence entirely mismatched to the modest role he was supposedly filling. He understood, watching her expression shift from curiosity to something closer to suspicion, that his disguise would not hold indefinitely, not with someone as observant as Margaret working within these walls every single day. The complications compounded further when Claire, without any prompting, began treating the disguised billionaire with a level of familiarity that Thomas had not planned for. She started greeting him by the false name on his badge, asking small questions about his day, occasionally mentioning details about her own life that felt unguarded in a way her public persona rarely allowed. Thomas found himself caught in an uncomfortable position he had never anticipated when designing this test, forced to reconcile the calculating, dismissive version of Claire he had witnessed in her worst moments with this warmer, more human version emerging in quieter ones. Whichever version was closer to the truth remained unclear, but one thing had become undeniable. Claire Bennett was far more complicated than either the public persona or his own private suspicions had prepared him to expect. 6 weeks into the disguise, an incident occurred that would finally force Claire Bennett into a position where performance and genuine character could no longer occupy the same space. A shipment of custom china, ordered specifically for the wedding reception, and worth well over $80,000, arrived damaged at the estate's front gate. The delivery company's paperwork clearly showed the packaging had been compromised before it ever reached the property, a manufacturing and handling failure that had nothing to do with anyone at the Whitmore estate. But Claire, arriving moments after the damage was discovered, and under pressure from a wedding planner, anxious about the timeline, needed someone to hold responsible, and the aging gate attendant, who had signed for the delivery, stood directly in front of her. For nearly a full minute, Claire stood over Thomas Whitmore, her voice rising in a way none of the household staff had witnessed from her before, insisting that his carelessness in accepting the shipment without a proper inspection had cost the wedding an irreplaceable set of china that could not be reordered in time. It did not matter to her in that moment that the delivery driver himself confirmed the damage predated the drop-off. It did not matter that Thomas had followed every protocol Walter Griggs had trained him on before this assignment began. What mattered, in the heat of her frustration, was that someone beneath her needed to absorb the consequences of a problem entirely outside his control, and Thomas, silent behind his disguise, absorbed every word of it without defending himself. Daniel arrived partway through the confrontation, drawn by the raised voices near the gate, and what happened in the next several minutes revealed something Thomas had not anticipated needing to witness. Rather than immediately taking Claire's side, Daniel asked calm, direct questions, requesting to see the delivery paperwork himself before assigning blame to anyone. When the documentation confirmed exactly what the driver had already stated, that the china had arrived damaged through no fault of the estate's staff, Daniel turned to Claire and gently, but firmly, suggested she owed the gate attendant an apology for the tone she had taken with him. It was, in that moment, watching his own son display more fairness toward a stranger than his fiancée had, that something shifted in Thomas's understanding of the situation unfolding around him. Claire's apology, when it came, was measured and brief, delivered with just enough sincerity to satisfy Daniel, without fully acknowledging the severity of what she had said moments earlier. Thomas accepted it with a quiet nod, playing the role required of him, but internally, he registered something far more important than the apology itself. He registered the instinct that preceded it, the immediate willingness to blame someone powerless the moment convenience demanded a target, followed only by correction once someone with actual influence intervened. It was not the worst thing he had ever witnessed a person do under pressure, but it was not nothing either, and Thomas had spent 3 decades learning that character reveals itself most clearly in exactly these unscripted moments, not in the ones where cameras and expectations shape behavior in advance. That evening, Margaret Alvarez found Thomas alone near the gatehouse after his shift had technically ended, and for the first time since his arrival, she spoke to him directly about what she had witnessed that afternoon. She did not accuse him of anything. She simply mentioned, carefully, that she had worked in this household long enough to recognize when someone was being unfairly treated, and that she hoped he understood the incident said far more about Claire than it did about him. Thomas thanked her, careful to maintain the calm, unremarkable demeanor his disguise required, but as Margaret walked away, he understood with growing certainty that his carefully constructed secret was becoming increasingly difficult to protect, not because of anything he had done wrong, but because the people around him were beginning to pay far closer attention than he had ever planned for. Daniel Whitmore had never questioned his father's disappearances before. Not really. Thomas had always operated on his own schedule, disappearing for stretches of business travel or quiet recovery without much explanation, and Daniel had long ago learned not to press for details his father was unwilling to offer. But nearly 7 weeks into this particular absence, small inconsistencies began accumulating in a way Daniel could no longer easily dismiss. His father's assistant, when pressed for specifics about the sabbatical, grew vague in a way that felt rehearsed rather than genuinely uncertain. Calls to the private number Thomas, normally answered within hours, went unreturned for days at a time, something that had never happened before, even during his most demanding business trips. The first real crack appeared when Daniel's aunt, Thomas's only surviving sibling, called asking why her brother had not returned any of her calls about a family matter she considered urgent. She mentioned, almost in passing, that she had tried reaching him at the wellness retreat his office had described, only to be told by the facility itself that no one by that name had ever been registered as a guest. Daniel brushed it off initially, assuming a miscommunication or an alias his father may have used for privacy, something Thomas had done before during high-profile business negotiations. But the comment lodged itself somewhere in the back of his mind, refusing to fully disappear even as wedding preparations demanded his full attention. It was Margaret Alvarez, ultimately, who gave Daniel a reason to look closer, though she never intended to reveal anything directly. During a conversation about staffing for the upcoming wedding, she mentioned, carefully and without elaboration, that the estate's new gate attendant seemed unusually capable for someone in his position, someone who moved and spoke with a confidence that felt slightly out of place. She did not accuse anyone of anything. She simply noted it as an observation, the kind of comment a longtime employee makes about a small detail that does not quite fit the pattern of everything else around it. Daniel thanked her, thought little of it in the moment, but found himself, days later, watching the gate attendant a little more closely than he ever had before. The accumulation of small inconsistencies finally reached a breaking point when Daniel discovered, while reviewing estate expenses for the wedding budget, an unfamiliar payment authorized weeks earlier under his father's private signature, a substantial sum paid directly to Walter Griggs, the estate's longtime gate attendant, for what the documentation vaguely described as an extended personal leave arrangement. Daniel stared at that line item for a long time, turning over possibilities that felt increasingly difficult to ignore. Why would his father personally authorize a significant payment to send Walter away, precisely around the same time he himself had vanished from public life? The pieces did not yet form a complete picture, but they were beginning, unmistakably, to point toward one. On the afternoon, everything would finally come together. Daniel found himself walking toward the front gate with a question he could no longer avoid asking directly. A folder of financial records tucked under his arm, prepared to confront the unfamiliar attendant about the strange payment connected to his sudden employment. He had no way of knowing, as he crossed the long stretch of driveway leading toward the gatehouse, that his fiancée was standing at that very gate at that very moment, engaged in a conversation with the same attendant that was about to become the most consequential exchange of her entire engagement. Two separate threads of suspicion, one belonging to the son, one belonging to the father, were converging on the exact same place, at the exact same time, and neither Daniel nor Claire had any idea how close the truth truly stood to being revealed. Claire had arrived at the gate that afternoon alone, unaware that her fiancé was approaching from the opposite direction with questions of his own, and unaware that the conversation she was about to have with a man she still believed to be nothing more than an aging estate employee would become the most important exchange of her engagement. She had come to ask him, of all people, for a favor, a small delivery she needed, picked up discreetly from a shop 2 towns over, something she did not want appearing on any household record or credit statement tied to the Whitmore name. It was a minor request on its surface, but the way she phrased it, the careful instruction to keep it quiet, told Thomas everything he had been waiting 7 weeks to learn. The item, as it turned out, was an engagement ring appraisal, not for the ring Daniel had given her, but for a second ring, an heirloom piece she had apparently acquired through means she never fully explained, one she intended to have valued and potentially sold before the wedding without her fiancé's knowledge. Thomas listened as she described exactly what she needed, her voice calm and businesslike in a way that revealed far more than she realized, because she was not speaking to him as a person capable of judgment. She was speaking to him as a tool, a convenient and disposable means of accomplishing something she did not want traced back to her. In that single request, delivered so casually at his own son's front gate, Thomas Whitmore heard the answer to a question he had spent 7 weeks trying not to assume he already knew. He asked her, carefully, playing the role of a curious but harmless old employee, why she needed the appraisal kept so quiet from a man who, by every outward appearance, trusted her completely. Claire hesitated for just a moment, a flicker of something crossing her expression before she recovered with practiced ease, explaining that she simply preferred to keep certain financial matters private. A woman's prerogative, she called it, smiling in a way clearly meant to close the subject entirely. But Thomas had spent 30 years reading people across negotiating tables, far more skilled at concealment than Claire Bennett, and what he heard beneath her explanation was not privacy, it was calculation, the quiet, methodical behavior of someone already planning contingencies for a life she had not yet fully committed to sharing. It was at this exact moment that Daniel rounded the corner of the driveway, folder of financial records still tucked under his arm, close enough to hear the final portion of the exchange between his fiancée and the gate attendant he had come specifically to question. He caught only fragments, a mention of a second ring, a request for secrecy, an unfamiliar transaction he had never once heard Claire describe in any of their conversations about their shared finances. Claire turned, startled by his sudden presence, and for one unguarded second before she could compose herself, Thomas watched something genuine cross her face for the first time in 7 weeks of careful observation. Not affection, not warmth, but the unmistakable panic of someone who has just realized they were overheard saying something they never intended anyone important to hear. The 3 of them stood at that gate in a silence that stretched far longer than any of them could have anticipated, Daniel searching Claire's face for an explanation, Claire searching desperately for words that could undo what had just been overheard, and Thomas, still hidden completely behind his disguise, watching the exact moment he had engineered 7 weeks earlier, finally arrive without any warning of its own. He had built this entire elaborate deception to witness precisely this kind of unguarded truth, and now that it had finally appeared, standing directly in front of him at his own son's gate, Thomas Whitmore found himself facing an entirely new question he had not fully prepared for. Now that the truth was visible, what exactly was he willing to do with it? Daniel did not raise his voice at first. He simply asked Claire, in a tone Thomas had never heard him use before, calm and controlled in a way that felt far more unsettling than shouting would have, to explain what he had just overheard about a second ring and a secret appraisal she had never once mentioned to him. Claire attempted to reframe it, calling it a misunderstanding, insisting the ring belonged to a distant relative and she had simply offered to help arrange its sale as a favor, nothing more. It was a plausible explanation on its surface, delivered with enough composure that, under different circumstances, it might have satisfied him. But Daniel had just spent the better part of an hour reviewing his father's financial records, and his patience for vague explanations had already worn dangerously thin before this conversation had even begun. It was Thomas, still standing quietly at the edge of the gate in his gray uniform, who made the decision that would end 7 weeks of careful concealment in a matter of seconds. He could have remained silent. He could have let his son and Claire resolve this moment without his involvement, retreating back into the invisible role he had inhabited so completely. But watching Claire construct an explanation designed specifically to deceive the one person who deserved absolute honesty from her, Thomas Whitmore felt something in him that no amount of careful planning had prepared him for, a father's protective instinct overriding every calculated decision he had made up to this point. He removed the cap from his head, straightened to his full height, and spoke for the first time that day, in the voice his own son would immediately recognize. The transformation that crossed Daniel's face in the following seconds moved through disbelief, confusion, and finally a dawning, horrified recognition that left him momentarily unable to speak. His father, the man he believed was recovering at a private retreat hundreds of miles away, stood directly in front of him wearing the uniform of an estate employee, having apparently worked at this gate, unnoticed, for nearly 2 months. Claire's reaction unfolded in an entirely different direction, her composure shattering completely as the full weight of the situation became clear to her. Every dismissive comment, every careless request, every unguarded moment she had allowed herself in front of a man she believed held no power over her life, suddenly revealed to have been witnessed by the single person on earth whose opinion could end her engagement with a single word. What followed was not the explosive confrontation the moment seemed to demand, but something quieter and, in its own way, far more devastating. Thomas explained calmly, without anger, exactly why he had done what he did. The years of watching wealth attract people whose intentions rarely matched their presentation, the promise he had made to himself the night Margaret died, the small but accumulating pattern of behavior he had witnessed over 7 weeks that had led him to this exact moment. He did not accuse Claire outright. He simply laid out what he had seen and heard, allowing his son to draw his own conclusions from evidence rather than accusation. Daniel stood between them, caught in a silence heavier than anything he had experienced in his adult life, forced to reconcile the woman he believed he knew completely with the version of her his own father had spent 7 weeks quietly documenting. Claire, given the opportunity to respond, chose not to deny what had happened, but instead turned her anger toward Thomas, accusing him of manipulation, of testing her unfairly, of creating an elaborate deception specifically designed to catch her at her worst moments rather than trusting her honestly. It was, in its own way, a fair accusation, one Thomas had already anticipated and privately wrestled with throughout the entire 7 weeks of his disguise. But as Daniel stood silently absorbing everything unfolding in front of him, one question remained unanswered, hanging over the entire estate like a decision no one present was yet prepared to make. Whatever Claire's true intentions had been, and whatever methods Thomas had used to uncover them, the wedding, the engagement, and the family itself now stood at a crossroads none of them could avoid any longer. The conversation that took place later that evening, behind the closed doors of Thomas Whitmore's study, was unlike any conversation father and son had ever had before. Daniel arrived still visibly shaken, the events of the afternoon replaying in a mind that had not yet found a stable place to rest. He did not sit down when he entered the room. He stood across from his father's desk, arms crossed, and asked the only question that mattered to him in that moment: why Thomas had chosen deception over simply telling him his concerns directly, why 7 weeks of secrecy had felt like the only acceptable path forward when a single honest conversation might have accomplished the same goal without any of the damage now sitting between them. Thomas did not offer excuses. He explained, as honestly as he had ever spoken to his son, that he had considered exactly that option months earlier, sitting alone in this same study, turning the idea over for weeks before ultimately rejecting it. He knew, from decades of watching his own instincts be dismissed as overprotective or paranoid by people who did not share his history, that simply voicing suspicion about Claire would likely have been received as exactly that: an aging father unable to accept that his son had found happiness with someone new. Words alone, he told Daniel, could be argued against, explained away, forgiven as misunderstanding. What he needed was not suspicion. He needed certainty, the kind that could only come from witnessing the truth directly, without performance standing between them. Daniel pushed back harder than Thomas had anticipated, arguing that certainty gained through deception was not the same as trust, that his father had effectively spied on the woman he loved for nearly 2 months without her knowledge or consent, regardless of what that surveillance ultimately revealed. He was not entirely wrong, and Thomas, to his credit, did not pretend otherwise. There was no version of this plan that avoided a fundamental betrayal of trust, whether or not Claire's own behavior had ultimately justified the suspicion that drove it. Thomas acknowledged this directly, admitting to his son that he had accepted, going into this plan, that he might damage his relationship with Daniel permanently in the process of trying to protect him, and that he had judged that risk worth taking anyway. What settled between them, eventually, was not full agreement, but something closer to a fragile understanding. Daniel needed time to process not just what Claire had done, but what his own father had been willing to do in secret for nearly 2 months without a single word of warning. He needed to reconcile the image of his father as a man who trusted him enough to let him make his own decisions with the reality of a father who had, in this instance, decided Daniel could not be trusted with the truth until it had already been proven beyond dispute. It was, Daniel admitted quietly, the most complicated version of love he had ever experienced from his father, protective to the point of betrayal, and he was not yet certain how to hold both of those truths at once. As the conversation drew toward its close, Thomas asked his son the one question he had genuinely not known the answer to throughout this entire 7-week ordeal: whether Daniel intended to proceed with the wedding despite everything that had been revealed. Daniel did not answer immediately. He stood in silence for a long moment, staring at the same desk his father had built an empire from decades earlier, weighing a version of Claire he thought he understood completely against a version his father had spent 7 weeks quietly documenting. Whatever he decided in the days that followed would not simply determine the fate of his engagement. It would determine, in ways neither man could yet fully articulate, what kind of relationship father and son would carry forward from this moment onward. News of the broken engagement, when it finally reached beyond the walls of the estate, spread through the small circle of family friends and business associates faster than anyone at the Whitmore household had anticipated. The official statement released by the family's spokesperson was deliberately vague, citing irreconcilable differences without any mention of the elaborate deception that had actually precipitated the split. Daniel had insisted on this discretion himself, unwilling to subject Claire to public humiliation, regardless of what had happened between them privately. Whatever anger he carried toward her, he did not believe it required an audience, a decision that surprised his father, who had expected a far harsher response from his son in the days following the confrontation at the gate. Claire left the estate 3 days after the incident, collecting her belongings quietly, without the confrontation or dramatic exit that gossip columns speculating about the sudden breakup seemed to expect. In the one conversation she and Daniel had before she departed, she did not attempt to defend the ring appraisal further, acknowledging instead that she had, at various points throughout their relationship, allowed herself to consider what financial security the marriage would provide, alongside whatever genuine feelings she held for him. It was, she admitted, an uncomfortable truth she had never fully examined in herself until it had been forced into the open, and she offered Daniel an honesty in that final conversation that had been notably absent throughout the 7 weeks Thomas had spent observing her. For Thomas, the aftermath brought a complicated mixture of vindication and regret that he had not fully anticipated when designing his plan months earlier. He had accomplished exactly what he set out to do, uncovering evidence of exactly the kind of divided loyalty he had feared Claire might harbor toward his son. But watching Daniel move through the following weeks in quiet, private grief, Thomas found himself questioning whether the cost of that certainty had been worth what it took from his relationship with his son in the process. Daniel remained cordial toward his father, but something had shifted between them, a new carefulness in their conversations that had not existed before, as though both men were now aware of exactly how far protective love could travel when left unchecked by open communication. It was during this period of quiet reckoning that a piece of information surfaced that neither Thomas nor Daniel had anticipated, one that would ultimately recontextualize much of what had happened over the preceding 7 weeks. Margaret Alvarez, the longtime housekeeper who had first noticed inconsistencies in the disguised gate attendant, came forward with an observation she had been hesitant to share earlier, uncertain of its relevance until the engagement had already ended. She revealed that Claire had, on more than one occasion during the months before the wedding, quietly and privately asked Margaret detailed questions about the household staff's wages and benefits, questions that had nothing to do with securing her own position and everything to do with whether the staff were being treated and compensated fairly under the family's employment. This single detail, small as it seemed against everything else that had unfolded, complicated the tidy narrative that had settled over the estate in the days following Claire's departure. It did not erase the troubling questions raised by the secret ring appraisal, nor did it excuse the sharp, dismissive moments Thomas had witnessed firsthand during his weeks at the gate. But it suggested, uncomfortably, that Claire Bennett had never been the simple villain the family's private conversations had begun to paint her as, nor the simple victim of an unfair test either. She had been, as most people ultimately are, a far more complicated combination of genuine care and self-interest than either Thomas's suspicion or Daniel's devotion had allowed room for, and that complexity was about to make the final chapter of this story far more difficult than anyone involved had expected. Daniel could not let Margaret's revelation rest without understanding it fully, and 3 weeks after Claire had left the estate, he made the decision to contact her directly, requesting a conversation neither of them had expected to happen again after such a painful ending. Claire agreed, and when they met, she finally explained the full context behind the questions she had been quietly asking about staff wages and benefits throughout their engagement, a context she had never shared with anyone at the estate, including Thomas during his weeks of careful observation. Her mother, the same single mother who had worked over 20 years as a receptionist at a small accounting firm, had spent much of Claire's childhood in a household employed by wealthy families who treated their staff with a casual disregard Claire had never forgotten witnessing firsthand. She explained that marrying into a household with dozens of employees had triggered something in her she had not fully anticipated, a quiet determination to ensure that whatever life she built with Daniel did not repeat the patterns she had watched destroy her own mother's sense of dignity for decades. The questions to Margaret had been an attempt, Clumsy and undisclosed as it was, to understand whether the Whitmore estate's treatment of its staff matched the values Daniel had always claimed to hold, a test of her own, running quietly in parallel to the one Thomas had been conducting without her knowledge. Neither Thomas nor Daniel had ever considered that Claire might be evaluating them just as carefully as Thomas had been evaluating her. This context did not erase the troubling truth of the ring appraisal, and Claire did not ask Daniel to pretend that it did. She admitted, with the same difficult honesty she had offered in their final conversation before leaving the estate, that she had genuinely considered the financial security this marriage represented, alongside her feelings for him, in a way she was not proud of and had never intended to act on before the wedding. She had planned to sell the ring, an inheritance from a grandmother she barely remembered, quietly and privately, not because she doubted her future with Daniel, but because she had spent her entire adult life believing she needed a private financial safety net, independent of any partner, a belief formed long before she ever met him, rooted in watching her own mother struggle without one. What emerged from this final conversation was not a simple redemption story, the kind that would neatly resolve every tension the previous 7 weeks had raised. Claire had made choices Thomas was right to view with suspicion, and Thomas had made choices about deception and surveillance that Daniel was right to view as a genuine betrayal of trust, regardless of what it ultimately revealed. Both truths existed simultaneously, refusing to cancel each other out into a clean resolution. Daniel found himself, in the weeks following this conversation, unable to fully return to the relationship as it once existed, but equally unable to view Claire as the singular villain his father's investigation had initially seemed to confirm. The final piece of this story would not resolve in a courtroom or a dramatic public reckoning, but in something quieter and, in many ways, more honest than either Thomas or Claire had expected when this entire test began. Daniel chose not to reconcile the engagement, deciding that trust, once fractured this completely on both sides, could not simply be rebuilt through explanation alone. But he also chose, in a decision that surprised his father considerably, to personally review and significantly improve the wage and benefit structure for every member of the Whitmore household staff, crediting the idea directly to a conversation Claire had once tried quietly to have without either of them ever knowing the other was listening. In the months that followed, the Whitmore estate settled into a quieter, more reflective version of itself, one shaped less by the wedding that never happened, and more by the uncomfortable truths that 7 weeks of deception had ultimately surfaced. Daniel returned to running his division of the company with a renewed focus, channeling much of his private processing into the staff reforms he had promised, working directly with Margaret Alvarez to ensure the changes reflected what employees actually needed rather than what looked generous on paper. It became, in an unexpected way, the most meaningful project of his professional life, one that traced its origin back to a woman he no longer spoke to and a father whose methods he still had not fully forgiven. Thomas and Daniel's relationship healed slowly, not through a single dramatic reconciliation, but through the accumulation of smaller, honest conversations neither man had prioritized before this ordeal forced them into practicing it. Thomas admitted, more than once, that he would make different choices if given the opportunity again. That certainty gained through deception had cost him something with his son that no amount of protective intention could fully justify. Daniel, in turn, came to understand his father's actions not as an excusable betrayal, but as an understandable one, born from a grief and protectiveness that had never found a healthier outlet in the decades since Margaret Whitmore's death. Understanding did not erase the hurt entirely, but it made room for something neither of them had expected to rebuild so soon, a version of trust between them that felt, in its own imperfect way, more honest than what existed before. Claire Bennett did not fade quietly from this story either. She returned to the career she had once given up in anticipation of a wedding that never happened, eventually using her own difficult experience to become an advocate for fair labor practices among domestic and household staff. Work she pursued with a conviction that suggested her private questions to Margaret had never been performance at all, but something genuinely rooted in who she was, underneath every complicated choice she had made. She and Daniel never fully reconciled as partners, but in a brief, unexpected meeting, nearly a year later, at an industry event neither had anticipated attending, they spoke civilly, even warmly, about the strange, painful test that had ultimately reshaped both of their lives in ways neither could have predicted when it began. What this story ultimately reveals is not a simple lesson about trust or wealth or deception, but something more complicated and, perhaps, more honest about how difficult it truly is to see another person clearly, especially when fortune and fear are both quietly shaping the lens through which we view them. Thomas Whitmore set out to protect his son from being deceived, only to discover that his own methods carried a deception of their own, one that revealed as much about his own unresolved grief as it did about Claire's genuine character. Claire, in turn, revealed herself to be neither the villain nor the victim this story initially seemed to be building toward, but simply a person shaped by her own history, making imperfect choices under circumstances few people are ever prepared to navigate gracefully. Would you have done what Thomas did, risking your relationship with your own child to uncover a truth you feared but could not prove any other way? Would you have forgiven him the way Daniel eventually did, understanding the fear behind the deception, even while carrying the weight of the betrayal it required? And what would you have discovered if someone you loved had been quietly watching the version of you that only exists when you believe no one important is paying attention? These are the questions this story leaves behind, without easy answers, exactly the way the truest stories about family, wealth, and trust usually do. Every family carries stories they never intend to share outside their own walls, and this one very nearly stayed that way, buried behind closed estate gates and quiet, private conversations that most people would never have been trusted to hear. What made the Whitmore family's story different was not the wealth involved, or the elaborate disguise, or even the broken engagement itself. It was the uncomfortable, universal truth sitting underneath all of it, that the people closest to us are often the hardest to see clearly, not because they are hiding something monstrous, but because fear, love, and self-protection have a way of distorting even our closest relationships without either side fully realizing it is happening. So we want to know what you would have done in Thomas Whitmore's position, watching someone you love prepare to marry into a fortune you spent an entire lifetime building, carrying a suspicion you could not fully prove and did not know how else to test. Would you have trusted your instincts the way he did, even knowing the cost it might carry with your own child? Or would you have chosen a harder, more honest conversation instead, risking that your son might dismiss your concerns entirely, the very outcome Thomas feared most when he first considered simply telling Daniel the truth? And what about Claire, a woman shaped by watching her own mother struggle for decades, carrying private fears about financial security that she never fully explained to the one person who deserved that honesty most? Was her silence a betrayal in its own right, even if her intentions toward Daniel were more complicated than anyone in this story initially assumed? Stories like this one rarely offer a villain simple enough to condemn without hesitation, and that discomfort, more than any single twist or reveal, is usually what stays with us longest after the story itself has ended. If this story left you thinking about the people closest to you, the ones you believe you understand completely, wait until you hear what happened in a family not far from this one, where a mother spent 20 years hiding a secret from her own children that would eventually unravel everything they believed about their childhood. That story, and many more like it, are waiting for you right here on this channel, so make sure you stay close, because the next family secret we uncover together might be the most unforgettable one yet. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment